Well, hello there and welcome to this revision video for our Year 7 inquiry question, what difference did the Black Death really make? So in looking at this question, we're looking at 5 different time periods. So we're finding out about 1347, life before the Black Death. We're finding out about what happened in 1348 as news reached Walsham about the Black Death. We're then finding out about April 1349, when the Black Death actually hit Walsham and people began to die. We're then looking at the immediate sort of short-term impact of the Black Death, and then we're looking from 1355 more about the long-term impact of the Black Death. This is John Hatcher. He's Professor of Economic and Social History at Cambridge University, and he's written a book called The Black Death, The Intimate Story of a Village in Crisis from 1345 to 1350. And due to its extensive historical sources, John Hatcher decided to write an in-depth story of the Black Death in Walsham based on historical evidence and using story and other historical sources to fill in the gaps. For example, we have no evidence for what the priest was called, but we know how priests at the time acted. Therefore, Hatcher imagined a character called Master John to be the priest of the village. His book is a thoroughly researched history book, but the way it's written enables us to fully immerse ourselves into finding out what difference the Black Death really made, and our inquiry is based on this book. So where is Walsham? Walsham was a fairly large village of over 1,000 people. It's located in Suffolk, in south, sort of the east, the sort of southern eastern part of England. It's close to the large towns of Ixworth and Bury St Edmunds, and there you can see it on the map there as well. So there's a little map here of Walsham, and you can sort of see like the main places within the actual village and the importance of the church, which was called St Mary's, for example. And so John Hatcher is obviously a historian. He's written a book which tells the story of the Black Death in Walsham. It's a village of over 1,000 people in Suffolk, and life there had not really changed dramatically for the previous few hundred years. The village had a lord of the manor who was really important and very wealthy, and they controlled things in the village, including holding a manor court every month to hear sort of legal cases and if people had broken the law or collected too much firewood from the woods, that type of thing. Now, many people in the village were villeins, which meant that they, as part of their kind of feudal system really, they had to work on the land of the lord of the manor and provide labour services, such as bringing in the harvest. So the lord of the manor didn't have to work on their own lands. Some people were very poor in the village. If there was a poor harvest, people at risk of famine or starvation. The types of housing they lived in was very sort of makeshift, for example. Now, one of the things that characterised people in 1347 is they were very religious, and the parish church, St Mary's, helped keep order and provide sort of spirituality for people in the village. Each villager also paid a tenth of their income to the church, which meant that the church as an institution was extremely wealthy. Now, much of the people of Walsham were involved in farming. This image here that you can see at the bottom shows people threshing corn in a different source, which is called the Luttrell Psalter, which is a prayer book produced by a member of the Lincolnshire gentry called Geoffrey Luttrell about 20 years before the events of the Black Death. So the Black Death arrived into Europe in around about 1348. And the Black Death kind of travelled quite slowly, but the Black Death made a difference to the people of Walsham even before they actually start to get ill from it. Now, Master John, who was the parish priest, would have first heard the news of the Black Death at Christmas 1347. But during 1348, people in Walsham began to hear more and more rumours of a terrible pestilence, as they called it. Remember, medieval people didn't call it the Black Death. They called it the pestilence or the plague, and it had been spreading from the east. Now, the Black Death most probably originated in China and travelled along the Silk Road, which were trading routes that connected China into Europe, reaching parts of Europe in sort of late 1347 into 1348. Now, the Black Death actually arrived in England, in southwest England, probably from Bordeaux in southwest France, a place which at the time was known as Melcombe Regis, but we now know as Weymouth. And it did actually travel quite slowly through England. So although the Black Death arrived in Weymouth in June 1348, it would take another sort of 9-10 months to actually reach Walsham in Suffolk. So Before it arrived, in many ways, life continued as normal in Walsham. The manor court still met, people paid fines, farming work continued to bring the harvest in as usual. People's religious beliefs remained and actually grew stronger. Many responded to the news, though, by going on pilgrimage to nearby Walsingham, and people used holy water to sprinkle on their homes and on their food as well. They hoped this would stop them from getting the Black Death, so many people believed the Black Death was spread by God. They had other ideas as well, like the humours, the fluids in the body being unbalanced, but generally one of the key explanations people gave for the Black Death was it was a punishment from God. People in Walsham did become more suspicious of travellers and they guarded routes into the village, and that would have been quite a sensible idea because actually that's how the Black Death was spread. Now, 11 villains actually shocked everyone by refusing to work the land of their lord, Lady Rose. They believed that there was little point as they thought the world was going to end. And this source, which is a wall painting in the chapel of St Sebastian in Savoy, France, from the mid to the late 15th century, depicts a terrified woman having a boil or a bubo cut from her neck, and just shows the kind of fear that people had of the Black Death during this time. Now, the Black Death arrived in Walsham in April 1349. Now, John Chapman was the husband of Alice Chapman. He was one of the first to die as described in John Hatcher's book. And St Mary's, the church in Walsham, remained a focal point of village life. Now, the Black Death had a devastating impact across England, and it probably led to the deaths of around about 50% of the villagers in Walsham. People's lives were turned upside down, so Agnes Chapman lost her husband John and brother Robert in the space of one day. The healer, Julia, was reluctant to visit people, so most villagers would have had a healer and a midwife in Walsham. She was called Julia. She was reluctant to visit people. And the priest, Master John, was exhausted from visiting so many people who were dying. Many priests and members of the clergy also died in the Black Death, which is obvious, really, because they were the ones that were visiting the sickest people, so they were likely to be able to catch the disease. Many priests, of course, shocked their communities by running away as well from the Black Death. People's religious beliefs remained mostly the same, at least in the short term. So Agnes Chapman was very concerned that her husband had not confessed his sins before death, and she was worried he would go to hell. People like Agnes continued to work the fields and tend our animals because life had to go on. Mourners at John's funeral, however, got paid a lot more. They went from earning 2 pence to 3.5 pence. Many of the dead were also buried in fields, rivers, or in graves that had been emptied of the previous occupants. So in the short term, there were some huge changes there into sort of funeral practices and what happened when people died. Literally, with there being so many people that were dying. Animals were untended in the fields, for example. Cows were not milked. That kind of thing happened. So what immediate difference did the Black Death make? Well, the Walsham Manor Court rolls indicate that well over 50% of people in Walsham died. They tell us that of 176 tenants, 109 died. So the death rate could have been as high as 55 to 60% in Walsham. And this is quite typical across England. Now, after the Black Death, as we've seen, wages began to rise. And King Edward III, who was the King of England at the time, he passed a law called the Statute of Labourers, which said that free and unfree peasants had to work for whoever wanted to hire them, and they had to work for the same wages as before the Black Death. In reality, this law was ignored by many villages like Walsham. Now, some women gained in the short term from the Black Death, such as Hilary Tiptoft, who was able to earn higher wages than she'd done before. And in fact, there were many more opportunities in the long term for women as well. Some wealthy people like Lady Rose de Saxham and Edmund de Wells lost out as some of their lands were no longer being rented out and they had to pay higher wages to workers. Now, many skilled workers had died, so one of the people that's characterised in John Hatcher's book is called Robert Carpenter. He's a carpenter. He found his skills much in demand, and he could charge double the price for work than before the Black Death. Business boomed in the local tavern, the inn, like the pub, for Alice Pye, who is a character that John Hatcher envisages in his book. She used her profits to buy some sheep, and she became richer than before. So for some survivors of the Black Death, there were more opportunities to become rich and wealthy and make money as a result of the Black Death. Now, in terms of some of the longer term impacts of the Black Death, some villagers led more prosperous lives by inheriting land or buying up flocks of sheep. Many farms and villages lay abandoned and lay empty, such as the village of Warren Percy in Yorkshire, which never really recovered from the Black Death. The Black Death also created fear and uncertainty among survivors. There was a great fear of death, and the plague did return over the years. Some people became stronger in their religious beliefs, but some began to question religion, and particularly the ideas of the Catholic Church. The population of England did not recover to pre-Black Death levels for 200 years. That shows a very significant long-term impact of the Black Death. Some people began to question authority and the right of the rich to rule, so the Black Death may have been a long-term cause of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Now, historians like Mark Bailey argue that real change from the Black Death did not happen until the 1370s. He argued that poor harvests and the return of the plague in the 1360s kept people poor. He said the Statute of Labourers passed by King Edward III and other measures meant the poor did not benefit that much from the Black Death. Historian Claire Kennan has written the Black Death led to more people living and working in towns, so people tended to leave their villages. She also discovered ordinary people began to buy goods which had been seen as luxury goods, such as silk clothes or fine leather shoes. And historian Caroline Barron has discovered the Black Death led to more opportunities in the long term for women. She found evidence of women running workshops and employing male servants, and women working as bakers and earning more money. Just a summary of some short-term changes and long-term changes, and of course, as we've seen, there's lots of continuities as well. So roughly half the villagers died. They suffered terribly before they died. Crops were left to rot in fields and animals were untended. There was nobody to milk the cows or some of the cows. Many villagers lost close family and friends. People became too afraid in the short term to talk to neighbours for fear of catching the plague, and villagers struggled to bury the dead according to proper Christian traditions. There are some long-term changes brought about by the Black Death. Some villagers became much more wealthy. They bought land or flocks of sheep. There was a shortage of workers to work in the Lord's fields, which meant some villages became permanently deserted, like Warren Percy in Yorkshire. Lords generally had to pay peasants more to get them to work. There were more job opportunities for some villagers, particularly women. The Black Death created a lot of fear and uncertainty for a long time for people. In addition, the plague kept returning. For some, it strengthened their religious beliefs. For others, it made them challenge the church. There were not enough priests long term. They had to change the age where people can become priests to make it younger to enable more to become priests. And long term, some peasants refused to obey the authority of their lords. The Black Death may well have been a long term cause of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. So there's an image of the Church of Warren Percy in North Yorkshire today, and an artistic interpretation of Warren Percy when it was a thriving village. So the deserted villages and more longer term consequence of the Black Death. And then that fear of death, so this is a picture made in 1493 called The Dance of Death, and we talked about the long-term connection between the Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt. That's a painting of Richard II meeting the rebels in the Peasants' Revolt in June 1381 from a chronicle in the 1470s by Jean Froissart. Okay then, so thanks for listening to that revision video on what difference did the Black Death really make. Thank you.